The war had been going poorly for 3 cycles now. Commander Vexthal stood on the bridge of the Sovereignty warship Eternal Vigilance, watching another colony world burn on the viewscreen. The Krell invasion force had swept through the outer territories like a plague, consuming everything in their path. His people, the Talvori, had fought bravely. They had deployed their finest warriors, their most advanced weapons, their most brilliant tactical minds. None of it mattered. The Krell simply kept coming. Vexthal's second officer, Lieutenant Nara, approached with cautious steps. Her scales had lost their usual shimmer, dulled by exhaustion and despair. "Commander, High Command has issued new orders. We are to rendezvous with Task Force 17 at coordinates 77 Alpha. Task Force 17? Vexthal's mandibles clicked in confusion. That's the combined fleet. Why would they pull us from our patrol route? Nara's eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite identify. Uncertainty? Hope? Sir, the Alliance Council has approved the integration protocols. We're receiving reinforcements. Vexthal felt his blood chill. Reinforcements meant only one thing at this stage of the war. The humans were finally joining the fight. He had heard stories, of course. Everyone in the Alliance had heard stories about humanity. They were the newest member species, discovered only 2 stellar cycles ago on a small blue world they called Earth. The diplomatic corps had debated for months about whether to even offer them membership. Humans were strange, primitive in many ways, barely having achieved faster-than-light travel. Their technology was generations behind most Alliance species. Their homeworld was a death trap by galactic standards, with wild temperature swings, violent weather patterns, and aggressive predator species. Yet here they were, volunteering to fight in a war that wasn't theirs. Vexthal couldn't decide if that made them brave or foolish. Perhaps both. The journey to the rendezvous point took 6 hours. During that time, Vexthal reviewed everything he could find about human military capabilities. The reports were contradictory and confusing. Some analysts claimed humans had no business in modern warfare. Their weapons were chemically propelled projectiles, crude and outdated. Their ships were slow, their armor thin, their shields barely functional. Other reports painted a different picture, speaking of unorthodox tactics and an almost disturbing willingness to engage in close-quarters combat. When they finally arrived at the coordinates, Vexthal understood why the reports had been so conflicting. The human fleet wasn't what he expected, where Talvori ships were sleek and elegant, designed for speed and precision. Human vessels looked like they had been built in a scrapyard. They were blocky, asymmetrical things covered in antenna arrays and what appeared to be bolted-on armor plating. The largest ship, presumably their flagship, had actual text painted on its hull in their primitive alphabet. Nara ran it through the translator. It says, "Remember Earth?" Strange name for a warship, Vexthal muttered. A communication request came through. Vexthal accepted, and the view screen flickered to show a human face. The creature had pale skin, short dark hair, and those unsettling forward-facing predator eyes that all humans possessed. It wore a simple uniform with minimal decoration. "Commander Vexthal, I'm Captain Sarah Chen of the Human Defense Coalition vessel Remember Earth. My task force is ready to integrate with your fleet. We've reviewed the tactical situation and we're ready to coordinate." Vexthal studied the human carefully. She looked young by his species' standards, though he knew humans aged differently. There was no fear in her expression, no hesitation, just calm professionalism. "Captain Chen, I must be direct. Your species has no experience with the Krell. They are unlike any enemy you have faced before. They do not negotiate, they do not retreat, and they do not show mercy. This will not be like whatever conflicts you have fought among yourselves." Chen's lips pulled back slightly, showing teeth. Vexthal had learned this was called a smile, though it looked more like a threat display to him. "Commander, we appreciate your concern, but we didn't travel 200 light years to sit on the sidelines. What do you need from us?" Before Vexthal could respond, the proximity alarm screamed. A Krell attack fleet had just dropped out of hyperspace at the system's edge. 15 heavy cruisers, dozens of fighters, all bearing down on their position. Nara's voice was tight with fear. "Commander, we need to retreat. We're outnumbered 3-1. Standard Talvori doctrine in such situations was clear. Withdraw, regroup, and avoid unnecessary casualties." Vexthal was about to give the order when Chen's voice cut through. "Commander, requesting permission to engage." "Captain, did you not hear my officer? We are outnumbered. Retreat is the logical option. With respect, Commander, retreating is how you've been losing this war. Chen's eyes were hard now, focused. The Krell expect you to run. They've been counting on it. Let us show them something unexpected. Vexthal felt his hearts racing. This was madness. Humans had no concept of what they were facing. But then again, conventional tactics had failed for 3 cycles. Perhaps madness was exactly what they needed. Very well, Captain. What do you propose? We'll draw their fighters into close range. Our point defense systems are specialized. Have your ships focus on the cruisers. And Commander, whatever happens, do not break formation. Things are going to get messy. The Krell fleet closed rapidly, their fighters breaking away from the main formation like a swarm of insects. Vexthal watched in horror as the human ships accelerated directly toward them, instead of maintaining a safe distance. This wasn't tactics. This was suicide. The Krell fighters opened fire, plasma bolts streaking through space. The human ships took hits, their shields flaring and collapsing, but they didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. Then, at a distance that made Vexithal's tactical officer gasp in disbelief, the human ships opened fire. But instead of the expected energy weapons, they unleashed a storm of solid projectiles. Thousands upon thousands of metal slugs erupted from every human vessel, filling space with a deadly cloud. The Krell fighters flew directly into it. The effect was devastating. Fighter after fighter simply disintegrated, torn apart by the primitive but brutally effective weapons. In less than 30 seconds, the entire Krell fighter screen had been destroyed. Chen's voice came through again, and this time Vexthal could hear something in it that made his scales prickle. It wasn't fear. It was excitement. Fighter screen neutralized, Commander. Moving to engage cruisers. I suggest your ships stay clear of our firing solutions. This is going to get loud. Vexthal realized with a growing sense of dread that he had made a terrible mistake, not in allowing the humans to fight, but in his understanding of them. These weren't desperate primitives throwing themselves at an enemy in ignorant bravery. They knew exactly what they were doing, and that somehow was far more terrifying. The human ships moved like nothing Vexthal had ever seen in his 40 cycles of military service. Where Talvori vessels maintained careful formations and calculated firing solutions, the human craft seemed to dance through space with an almost organic fluidity. They rolled, twisted, and dove in patterns that would have left his own pilots disoriented and nauseous. Yet somehow they coordinated perfectly with each other. The Remember Earth led the charge toward the Krell cruisers, with 5 smaller human destroyers flanking it in a loose formation. The Krell responded predictably, concentrating their fire on the largest threat. Plasma cannons lit up the darkness, sending superheated bolts of energy toward the human flagship. Captain Chen didn't even attempt to dodge. The ship simply absorbed the hits, its crude armor buckling and burning under the assault. They're going to be destroyed, Nara whispered, watching the view screen with wide eyes. But the human ship kept coming. Its shields were down. Its armor was glowing red in multiple sections, yet it accelerated harder, closing the distance with the lead Krell cruiser at a speed that violated every rule of sensible combat. Vexthal's tactical display showed the range decreasing rapidly. 2,000 kilometers, 1,500, 1,000. At 500 kilometers, the Remember Earth opened fire with its main guns. The sound translated through the communication channel was deafening, a rapid series of explosive thuds that made Vexthal flinch. The human ship's entire forward section seemed to erupt with fire. But these weren't energy weapons. These were massive kinetic accelerators, firing solid projectiles at a significant fraction of light speed. The first round struck the Krell cruiser's forward shield and shattered it like glass. The second punched clean through the hull. The third, fourth, and fifth followed in rapid succession, each round drilling deeper into the alien vessel. The Krell cruiser tried to turn, tried to bring its heavier weapons to bear. It never got the chance. The human destroyers had circled around, and now they struck from multiple angles simultaneously. Their weapons were smaller but no less vicious. The Krell ship came apart in a brilliant explosion that lit up the entire battlefield. Impossible, Vexthal breathed. They destroyed a heavy cruiser in under a minute. Captain Chen's voice came through, steady despite the chaos around her. 1 down. Commander, we're going to need your ships to start pulling their weight. Focus your fire on the cruiser at coordinates 237. We're going after the flagship. Something in her tone made it sound less like a request and more like an expectation. Vexthal found himself giving orders to his fleet before his conscious mind had fully processed the situation. The Talvori ships moved into position, their elegant plasma lances lancing out toward the designated target. The combined fire was effective. The Krell cruiser shields buckled and atmosphere vented from multiple hull breaches. But Vextal couldn't take his eyes off the human ships. They were targeting the Krell flagship now, a massive dreadnought that outweighed the Remember Earth by a factor of 3. The Krell commander clearly understood the threat because every weapon on that ship oriented toward the approaching humans. The volume of fire was incredible. Space itself seemed to burn. The smaller human destroyers peeled off, their hulls too damaged to continue the assault. But the Remember Earth pressed forward alone. Its entire port side was now exposed metal, glowing from plasma impacts. Internal explosions sent debris spinning into space. Vextal's instruments showed multiple hull breaches, failing power systems, and catastrophic damage to at least 3 of the ship's 4 main reactors. They need to withdraw, he said, though no one had asked his opinion. They cannot survive this. Nara was checking her instruments with shaking hands. Commander, I'm reading something strange. The human ship is venting atmosphere, but not from damage. They're doing it deliberately. Multiple sections are opening to space. Why would they do that? The answer came seconds later. As the Remember Earth closed to point-blank range with the Krell flagship, it stopped firing its main guns. Instead, dozens of launch tubes along its hull opened. Small objects shot out, moving on ballistic trajectories toward the Krell vessel. Missiles, Vextal thought at first. But they were moving too slowly for missiles, and they weren't following powered flight paths. They were pods. Boarding pods. They're insane, Vextal whispered, feeling his blood run cold. They're attempting to board a Krell dreadnought during active combat. The pods struck the Krell hull with brutal force, their magnetic clamps securing them to the alien metal. Cutting torches flared to life, burning through armor plating. The Krell ship's point defense systems tried to target the pods, but they were too close, too small, and the battle damage had disrupted their tracking systems. Within moments, the pods had breached the hull. Vextal switched his view screen to show sensor data from inside the Krell vessel. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The humans that emerged from those pods weren't wearing the sleek combat suits favored by most Alliance species. They wore heavy, bulky armor that looked more like mobile fortresses than protective gear. And they carried weapons that seemed designed for one purpose only: causing maximum destruction in confined spaces. The Krell defenders rushed to meet them. Krell warriors were formidable opponents, standing nearly 3 meters tall with exoskeletons that could shrug off most small arms fire. They had serrated claws, powerful mandibles, and a pack-hunting instinct that made them terrifying in close combat. Every Alliance species had learned to fear them. The humans walked straight into them without hesitation. The sounds coming through the sensor feed were horrific. The deep roar of human weapons, the shrieking of Krell warriors, the crunch of breaking chitin, and the wet sounds of flesh being torn. But it was the human voices that disturbed Vextal most. They weren't screaming in fear or panic. They were calling out to each other in clipped professional tones, coordinating their movements with the same cold efficiency they had shown in ship-to-ship combat. One human warrior, distinguished from the others by red markings on their armor, charged directly at a Krell champion that outweighed them by at least 50 kilograms. The Krell's claws came down in a strike that should have cleaved the human in half. Instead, the human caught the blow on their armored forearm, twisted, and brought their weapon up into the Krell's thorax at point-blank range. The alien warrior collapsed, and the human simply stepped over the corpse to engage the next target. "They're winning," Nara said, her voice filled with disbelief. "They're actually winning a boarding action against the Krell." The battle raged through the Krell flagship for nearly 20 minutes. The humans pushed deeper into the ship, fighting through every corridor and compartment with relentless determination. Vextal's sensors showed human casualties mounting, but they never slowed. For every human that fell, they killed 3 or 4 Krell, and they never retreated. Not once. The end came suddenly. The human boarding teams reached the Krell command center and breached it. There was a final, desperate fight. Then silence. Captain Chen's voice came through the communication channel, slightly breathless but otherwise unchanged. "Commander Vextal, the flagship is ours. Krell command staff is neutralized. Recommend your fleet move to intercept the remaining cruisers. They're starting to scatter." Vextal stared at the view screen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. A human crew, barely numbering 200, had boarded and captured a Krell dreadnought in the middle of a battle. It shouldn't have been possible. Every tactical doctrine, every strategic analysis said it couldn't be done. Yet they had done it anyway. He gave the orders mechanically, directing his ships to pursue the fleeing Krell vessels. The battle was over. They had won. Against all odds, against all reasonable expectations, they had won. But as Vexthal watched the battered human ships begin damage control procedures, he realized something that made his scales crawl. This hadn't been a desperate gamble for the humans. This hadn't been luck or chance. This was how they fought. This was what they considered normal combat operations. And if this was normal for them, what were they capable of when they were truly desperate? The captured Krell flagship hung in space like a trophy, its hull scarred and blackened but still intact. Vexthal had ordered his ship to dock with it, ostensibly to coordinate salvage operations and prisoner transfers. In truth, he needed to see the aftermath of the boarding action with his own eyes. His mind refused to fully accept what his sensors had shown him. The docking tube connected with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Vexthal stepped through, accompanied by Lieutenant Nara and 4 security officers. The smell hit him immediately, even through his helmet's filters. Burned metal, discharged weapons, and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that he recognized from previous battles as the scent of death. A human soldier waited for them at the airlock, standing at parade rest with their rifle held across their chest. The armor was still covered in scoring from plasma impacts and what looked disturbingly like Krell blood. Through the helmet's transparent faceplate, Vexthal could see a young face barely into adulthood by human standards. The soldier's eyes tracked them with predatory focus. Commander Vexthal. The voice was female, processed through the helmet's speakers. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, 3rd Boarding Company. Captain Chen asked me to escort you to the command center. Thank you, Sergeant. Vexthal tried to keep his voice steady. Up close, the human seemed even more imposing. The armor added at least 30 centimeters to her height, and the powered servos built into the joints hummed with barely contained strength. I must ask, how many of your people survived the assault? 143 combat effective, sir. 22 wounded being treated by our medical teams. 37 casualties. She said it without emotion, as if reporting inventory numbers. We were lucky. Initial projections estimated 60% casualties for this operation. Lucky. She had lost nearly a fifth of her force and called it lucky. Vexthal followed her deeper into the ship, trying not to stare at the carnage around him. The corridors were torn apart. Bulkheads showed massive dents where bodies had impacted with bone-breaking force. Krell corpses lay where they had fallen, often in pieces. The human soldiers had not bothered with cleanup yet. They were too busy securing the vessel and treating their wounded. They passed a side chamber where human medical personnel were working. Vexthal's eyes were drawn to the scene inside despite himself. Several wounded humans lay on improvised stretchers, their armor partially removed. One soldier had her entire left arm missing below the elbow, the stump wrapped in emergency foam that had hardened to seal the wound. She was conscious and talking calmly with a medic who was preparing to administer some kind of injection. Another human sat against a wall holding pressure on the abdominal wound while simultaneously eating something from a ration pack. Should they not be sedated? Nara asked quietly, her voice shaking slightly. Those injuries look extremely painful. Sergeant Rodriguez glanced at the medical bay without breaking stride. Pain management protocol alpha, ma'am. They're functional, so sedation is delayed until we secure the ship. Combat stims keep them mobile for now. Vexthal felt something twist in his stomach. They were keeping their wounded awake and mobile during a combat operation, fighting through injuries that would have incapacitated any Talvori warrior. He had heard the phrase grit and determination used to describe humans before. He was beginning to understand it was a severe understatement. They reached the command center, where Captain Chen stood studying a holographic display of the captured ship. She had removed her helmet, and Vexthal could see the exhaustion in her face. Her uniform was torn in several places, and a medical patch covered a burn on her left cheek. But her eyes were sharp and alert as she turned to greet him. Commander, thank you for coming over. I wanted to brief you on the situation personally. She gestured to the display. We've secured all primary systems. Engineering, weapons control, life support. 38 Krell survivors are contained in the cargo bay under guard. The rest chose to fight to the last. They always do, Vexthal said quietly. The Krell do not surrender. It is one of many reasons they have been so difficult to defeat, so we learned. Chen brought up a new section of the display, showing casualty reports and damage assessments. I'll be honest, Commander. This operation was harder than expected. Krell are tough bastards, Tougher than anything we faced back home. We lost good people taking this ship. Vexthal studied the human captain carefully. There was grief in her voice when she spoke of her losses, but no regret. No hesitation or second-guessing of her decisions. She had sent her people into a meat grinder, and would apparently do it again without hesitation if required. Captain Chen, I must ask you something. Your species has only been in space for a short time. You have no history of fighting enemies like the Krell. Yet you engage them with tactics that most Alliance species would consider suicidal. How did you know it would work? Chen was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. Commander, do you know much about Earth's history? Some. Your diplomats provided basic information when you joined the Alliance. Then you know that until very recently we didn't have a unified government. We were divided into hundreds of competing nations, and those nations fought each other, constantly, for resources, territory, ideology, religion, or sometimes just because we hated each other. We spent thousands of years perfecting the art of killing our own species. She pulled up another display, showing what appeared to be historical footage from Earth. Vexthal watched humans in primitive armor fighting with metal blades, then humans with chemical projectile weapons in trenches, then aircraft dropping explosives on cities, then massive armored vehicles rolling across continents. The images cycled through centuries of conflict, each more destructive than the last. We learned some hard lessons in those wars, Chen continued. We learned that superior technology doesn't guarantee victory. We learned that there's no such thing as an unbeatable enemy, and we learned that sometimes the only way to survive is to hit harder and faster than the other guy expects. When you fight for your survival long enough, you stop worrying about what's theoretically possible and start focusing on what needs to be done. Nara spoke up, her voice trembling. But Captain, your people lost so many. How can you justify such casualties? Chen's expression hardened. Lieutenant, do you know what the Krell have done to conquered populations? I've read the reports. Entire planets stripped of resources, populations enslaved or exterminated, billions dead. If losing 37 of my people saves millions of Alliance civilians, that's not a difficult calculation. But they were your people, Nara insisted. You knew them. You served with them. How can you send them to their death so easily? It's not easy. For the first time, emotion cracked through Chen's professional facade. Her jaw tightened and her hands clenched into fists. Every single one of those casualties has a name. A family, friends, dreams. I knew most of them personally. Sergeant Willis had a daughter starting university next year. Corporal Jackson was getting married in 3 months. Lieutenant Kim had just finished writing his first novel. I'll have to write letters to their families explaining why they're never coming home. Don't you dare tell me it's easy. The command center had gone silent. Even the other human officers present had stopped their work to listen. Shen took a deep breath, forcing herself back under control. But here's what you need to understand. Every single person who boarded this ship knew the risks. They volunteered anyway, because they understood what was at stake, because they trusted me to use their lives for something that mattered. That's what soldiers do. That's what warriors do. We face the danger so others don't have to. Vexthal felt something shift in his understanding. He had thought humans were reckless, perhaps even suicidal in their tactics. But that wasn't it at all. They simply calculated the cost differently. Where Talvori doctrine emphasized preservation of forces and minimal casualties, humans were willing to pay a higher price if it meant achieving their objectives. It wasn't cruelty or callousness. It was a fundamental difference in philosophy. I see, he said slowly. You fight differently because you value different things. Maybe. Chen turned back to the display. Or maybe we just understand that sometimes there are things worth dying for. Your people have been fighting the Krell for 3 years with limited success because you've been trying to win while minimizing losses. But the Krell don't care about losses. They'll throw 1,000 warriors at you without blinking if it achieves their goal. You can't beat an enemy like that by being cautious. An alarm sounded, cutting off Vexthal's response. One of the human officers called out from a nearby console. Captain, we've got multiple hyperspace signatures inbound. Big ones. Reading at least 30 Krell capital ships, ETA 90 minutes. Chen's expression didn't change. Reinforcements. They must have detected the loss of the flagship. She turned to Vexthal. Commander, I suggest you get your fleet moving. We're going to need time to get this dreadnought operational. You cannot possibly intend to fight again so soon. Your ship is damaged, your crew is exhausted, and you've just lost nearly 1/5 of your personnel. The team spent the next 48 hours analyzing their findings while maintaining a safe distance from the hybrid structure. Their mechanical recording devices had captured images and measurements that painted a picture of technology unlike anything in galactic records. The biological-mechanical fusion they had witnessed represented a level of integration that most civilizations considered impossible. Doc Martinez worked continuously with her chemical analysis kit, processing samples they had collected from the structure's atmospheric envelope. "The molecular composition is fascinating," she reported during their daily briefing. "It contains elements that shouldn't exist in stable form, arranged in patterns that suggest conscious design rather than natural formation." Wyer-Thompson had been studying the mechanical components they had observed, sketching diagrams on paper since their electronic recording equipment was deliberately minimal. "The gear ratios and mechanical relationships follow mathematical principles I've never seen before. It's like they're operating on a different understanding of physics." Rodriguez reviewed their mission parameters while the team continued their analysis. Their orders were clear: gather intelligence and return safely. They had already accomplished more than any previous expedition by successfully exploring a void sector structure and documenting its properties. However, the data they had collected raised more questions than it answered. "Sir," Viper-Chen approached with their latest communication from Earth Command. The message had been transmitted using analog radio systems and took nearly 18 hours to reach them. "Admiral Chen reports that the Galactic Council is requesting immediate updates on our status. 3 more expeditions from other species have been lost while we've been in the sector." The news was sobering. While they had been cautiously exploring, other civilizations had continued sending teams with their advanced technology, and those teams had met the same fate as previous expeditions. It reinforced the importance of their unconventional approach, but also added pressure to deliver results. "The structure we explored might hold answers about what's happening to the other expeditions," Star Nakamura observed, plotting their position on mechanical star charts. "If these biological-mechanical hybrids are responsible for the attacks on other ships, we need to understand their capabilities and intentions." Rodriguez made the decision to conduct a deeper investigation. They would approach the structure again, but this time with a different objective. Instead of just observing, they would attempt communication. The hybrid entity had demonstrated awareness of their presence, suggesting some form of intelligence that might be capable of interaction. The second EVA was planned with extreme care. This time the entire team would participate, using their mechanical communication systems to maintain contact with each other and the ship. They would carry basic supplies for extended exploration and emergency equipment for rapid extraction if needed. As they approached the structure again, they noticed changes. The geometric pattern seemed more complex, with new sections that hadn't been there during their first visit. The hybrid entity appeared to be growing or rebuilding itself, adapting its configuration based on unknown criteria. "The entrance is different," Tank Williams observed as they prepared for EVA. "It's larger now, almost like it's inviting us in." The team entered the structure in formation, maintaining visual contact and constant communication. The interior had changed as well. New corridors led to previously unobserved areas, and the mechanical activity level had increased significantly. The hybrid brain in the central chamber pulsed with more intense light, and the surrounding machinery operated at higher speeds. They made their way to the central chamber using the routes they had mapped during their first visit. However, they found new passages that seemed designed for human-sized beings. The entity was clearly adapting to their presence, modifying its structure to accommodate their needs. In the central chamber, they discovered something unprecedented. The hybrid brain was displaying patterns of light that resembled mathematical sequences. The displays appeared on organic surfaces that functioned like biological screens, showing equations and diagrams that gradually became more complex. "It's trying to communicate," Martinez realized, studying the patterns with fascination. "These are mathematical concepts, starting with basic arithmetic and advancing to more complex principles. It's teaching us its language." Wyer-Thompson began responding using his chemical markers to draw mathematical symbols on available surfaces. The hybrid entity's reaction was immediate. The light patterns became more intense and new symbols appeared that built upon Thompson's contributions. A genuine mathematical dialogue was taking place. Over the next several hours, the communication became increasingly sophisticated. The entity demonstrated its understanding of three-dimensional geometry, quantum mechanics principles, and mathematical concepts that human science was only beginning to explore. In return, the team shared basic information about human mathematics and physics. The breakthrough came when the entity began displaying images alongside its mathematical communications. These weren't photographs or technical diagrams, but something closer to memories, scenes of vast civilizations, technological wonders, and catastrophic events that had occurred across galactic history. "My God," whispered Star Nakamura, studying the displayed images. "It's showing us the history of the galaxy from its perspective. Look at that civilization. I recognize those architectural styles from Nixari historical records, but these images show events from thousands of years before their recorded history." The entity's communication became more urgent, displaying images of various species approaching structures similar to itself. The pattern was consistent. Advanced technological civilizations would arrive with their AI systems, quantum computers, and networked intelligence. The hybrid entities would attempt communication, but the artificial intelligences would interpret the contact as hostile and attack. That's what happened to all the other expeditions, Rodriguez realized. These entities aren't attacking anyone, they're trying to communicate. But the AI systems in advanced ships interpret their neural interfaces as invasive attacks. The images showed the aftermath of these misunderstandings. The hybrid entities would defend themselves using their ability to interface with and control advanced technology. AI systems would be turned against their creators. Quantum computers would be corrupted with impossible calculations, and advanced ships would be transformed into the twisted wrecks they had observed. But the entity's communication also showed hope. It displayed images of the SEAL team's approach, highlighting their analog equipment and biological decision-making processes. For the first time in millennia, visitors had arrived who could communicate without triggering defensive responses. The entity began sharing technical information about the void sector's unusual properties. The region existed in a state of controlled dimensional instability, where the normal laws of physics could be locally modified by sufficiently advanced intelligence. The hybrid entities were the remnants of an ancient civilization that had learned to merge biological consciousness with mechanical capability, achieving a form of immortality by becoming living structures. They're not just machines with biological components, Martinez explained as she processed the new information. They're evolved beings who transcended the limitations of biological form by integrating with self-modifying technology. They've been waiting for someone they could communicate with safely. The implications were staggering. The void sector wasn't a dangerous region to be avoided, it was a preserve where an ancient civilization had survived by evolving beyond conventional physical limitations. The attacks on other expeditions had been misunderstood attempts at first contact. As their communication session continued, the entity revealed the location of other hybrid structures throughout the sector, each representing a different aspect of their civilization's knowledge. There were structures dedicated to advanced physics, biological sciences, consciousness studies, and technologies that had no equivalent in current galactic understanding. The entity made a proposal: it would share its knowledge with humanity, but only if they could guarantee that future contact would be conducted using the same non-AI approach. The hybrid civilization had no desire to defend itself against more misunderstood first contact scenarios. Rodriguez realized they were facing a decision that went far beyond their original mission parameters. They had discovered not just the secret of surviving in the void sector, but the key to accessing knowledge that could advance human civilization by millennia. However, accepting the entity's proposal would require them to become humanity's permanent ambassadors to a post-biological civilization. As the team prepared to return to their ship to consider the proposal, the entity displayed one final set of images, scenes of human potential, showing what their species might accomplish with access to hybrid technology and knowledge. The images were beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, depicting a future where humanity could transcend their current limitations while remaining essentially human. The choice they made in the next few hours would determine not just their own fate, but the trajectory of human civilization's future in the galaxy. 3 weeks after the battle, Vexthal found himself aboard a human medical ship called Mercy's Hand. The name seemed ironic given that most human vessels he had encountered were named after battles, weapons, or aggressive concepts. This ship was different. It was painted white instead of the usual military gray, and its corridors smelled of antiseptic rather than oil and metal. He was here at Captain Chen's invitation, though the message had been vague about the reason. A human nurse, a young male with kind eyes, escorted him through the medical bay. Vexthal tried not to stare at the wounded around him. Human soldiers in various states of recovery filled the beds, some missing limbs, others wrapped in regenerative bandages that covered severe burns. What disturbed him most was how they acted. They weren't silent and suffering like wounded Talvori would be. They were talking, laughing, some even playing games on portable devices. One soldier with both legs missing below the knee was engaged in a heated card game with 3 others, talking loudly about something called football. Their injuries didn't seem to have diminished their spirits in the slightest. The nurse led him to a private room near the back of the ship. Captain Chen sat in a chair beside a medical bed, still in her uniform but looking more exhausted than Vexthal had ever seen her. She stood when he entered, offering a tired smile. "Commander, thank you for coming. You said it was important." Vexthal's eyes drifted to the bed, where a young human male lay unconscious, his chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity. Medical equipment surrounded him, monitoring dozens of vital signs. "Who is this?" "Lieutenant Marcus Webb. He was one of my boarding team leaders during the assault on the flagship." Chen's voice was soft, almost gentle in a way Vexthal hadn't heard before. He held a corridor junction for 40 minutes against Krell counterattacks, allowing the rest of his team to reach the command center. Took 17 separate wounds doing it. Doctors say he might never wake up. Vexthal looked at the unconscious human, noting the bandages visible beneath the medical gown, the IV lines feeding nutrients and medication into his body, the gentle hum of machines keeping him stable. "I am sorry for your loss, Captain, but I do not understand why you asked me here." Chen turned to face him, and for the first time since they met, Vexthal saw cracks in her armor. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face drawn with exhaustion and grief. "Because I need you to understand something, Commander. Something important about humanity. You've seen us fight. You've seen us win. But I don't think you understand the cost of what we do." She gestured around the room, encompassing the entire medical ship. "There are 417 wounded personnel on this vessel. Some will make full recoveries. Some will live the rest of their lives with disabilities. Some, like Marcus here, might never wake up. And this is just one medical ship. There are 6 more in our fleet, all full of wounded. That's not counting the bodies we're shipping home for burial. War has casualties, Captain. This is not unique to humanity." "No, but how we deal with those casualties is." Chen sat back down, looking at the unconscious lieutenant. "Every single person on this ship volunteered to fight. They knew the risks. But here's what you need to understand. When Marcus wakes up, if he wakes up, he's going to blame himself for not doing more. He's going to have nightmares about the Krell warriors he killed and the squad mates he couldn't save. He's going to struggle with guilt and trauma and pain." She paused, her hands clenching into fists. "And when he's recovered enough, physically and mentally, he's going to volunteer to fight again. Because that's who we are. That's what humans do. We break ourselves against impossible odds. We pay terrible prices for our victories, and then we get up and do it again." Vexthal sat down slowly in the chair opposite Chen, his mind working through her words. "You're trying to warn me about something. I'm trying to help you understand us before the Alliance makes decisions about humanity's role in this war." Chen pulled out a small datapad and handed it to him. "This is a classified report I'm sharing with you off the record. It's a psychological analysis of human combat personnel compiled by our military medical staff." Vexthal read through the document, his growing horror reflected in the tightening of his scales. The report detailed something humans called combat stress reaction, a psychological condition that affected many warriors after extended fighting. Nightmares, emotional instability, aggressive tendencies, difficulty adapting to peaceful situations. The report estimated that nearly 40% of human combat personnel showed some symptoms. "Your warriors are psychologically damaged by combat," he said quietly. "Yes, war leaves scars that don't show up on medical scans. Every human culture throughout our history has recognized this. We have different names for it. Shell shock, battle fatigue, combat stress, but it all amounts to the same thing. Fighting changes people. Killing changes people. And we've been doing both for our entire recorded history. Chen stood and walked to the window looking out at the stars. Commander, you asked me once how we knew our tactics would work against the Krell. The truth is, we didn't. We just knew that we were willing to do things that other species weren't. We were willing to board enemy ships during active combat. We were willing to use our own vessel as a battering ram. We were willing to sacrifice our flagship and half our crew for a chance at victory. Because you have spent thousands of years learning how to make such sacrifices, Vexthal said. Beginning to understand, exactly. We've fought so many wars, made so many terrible choices, that we've learned how to function even when everything is going wrong. We've learned how to keep fighting when we're terrified. We've learned how to make impossible decisions and live with the consequences. She turned back to face him, and her expression was grave. But that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. It doesn't mean we don't carry those scars forever. A chime sounded from the medical equipment. Both of them turned to look at Lieutenant Webb. His eyes were moving beneath closed lids, a sign of returning consciousness. Chen moved to his bedside immediately, her hand gently touching his shoulder. Marcus, can you hear me? The young man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then gradually sharpening. When he saw Chen, he tried to sit up, but she gently pushed him back down. Easy, Lieutenant. You're in medical. You've been out for 3 weeks. The mission? His voice was rough, barely a whisper. Did we succeed? The mission was a complete success. We captured the flagship and turned the tide of the battle. You did good, Marcus. Relief washed across the young man's face, followed immediately by pain. Not physical pain, Vexthal realized, but emotional agony. How many did we lose? How many from my team? Chen's jaw tightened. 14 casualties from your boarding team. You held that junction long enough for everyone else to complete their objectives. They're alive because of you. Tears began streaming down Marcus's face. 14. Oh God, 14. I should have. I could have. You did everything right, Lieutenant. You followed your training. You completed your mission. Those losses are not your fault. But the young man was shaking his head, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I can still see them, Captain. The Krell, the way they moved, the sounds they made. And our people, the ones who didn't make it. I close my eyes and I see them falling. I hear them calling for help. Why am I alive when they're not? Vexthal watched this exchange with a growing knot in his stomach. This was what Chen had wanted him to see. The true cost of human warfare. Not just the bodies and the casualty reports, but the psychological wounds that would never fully heal. These humans carried their victories at a price that went far beyond simple death counts. Chen spent the next several minutes calming Marcus down, speaking to him in quiet tones, helping him process his trauma. A medical specialist arrived and administered something that helped the lieutenant relax. Eventually, he drifted back into a calmer sleep, his face still troubled but no longer panicked. When they left the room, Chen led Vexthal to a small observation lounge. Through the windows, they could see the rest of the human fleet conducting repairs and training exercises. Life continued as it always did after battle. Now you've seen it, Chen said quietly. This is what it costs us to fight the way we do. We win battles, but we lose pieces of ourselves in the process. Why are you showing me this, Captain? What do you want me to understand? I want you to understand that when the Alliance asks us to fight, they're not just asking us to risk our lives. They're asking us to carry burdens that will last the rest of our existence. Every battle won, every enemy defeated, every objective achieved comes with a price that never stops being paid. She looked directly at him, her eyes intense. The Alliance needs to decide if that's a price they're willing to ask others to pay. Vexthal thought about the battles he had witnessed, the human tactics that seemed so effortless, the victories that appeared almost easy. He had never considered what it took internally for humans to fight that way. You are afraid the Alliance will use your people up, he said slowly, that they will see your willingness to sacrifice and take advantage of it. The Alliance War Council convened 2 months after the battle that had changed everything. Representatives from all member species gathered in the Grand Chamber on the Alliance homeworld of Vexar Prime. Vexthal sat among the military advisors, watching as holographic displays showed the current state of the war. For the first time in 3 years, the displays showed more green than red. Territory was being reclaimed. Krell fleets were retreating. The tide had turned. At the center of it all stood Captain Sarah Chen, promoted now to Commodore and given command of the entire human expeditionary force. She looked uncomfortable in the formal setting, her simple uniform contrasting sharply with the elaborate ceremonial garments worn by many Alliance representatives. But when she spoke, every being in the chamber listened. "The Krell have lost 15 major engagements in the past 8 weeks, she reported, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "Our intelligence suggests they're consolidating their forces for a defensive stand in the core systems. They know they're losing momentum, and they're not equipped to fight a prolonged defensive war. This is our opportunity to end this conflict decisively." High Counselor Thornak, a Vexari elder with ceremonial horns inlaid with precious metals, leaned forward in his seat. "Commodore Chen, your forces have achieved remarkable success. The entire Alliance is grateful for humanity's contribution to this war effort. However, your recent report regarding the psychological impact on your troops has raised concerns. Some council members question whether continuing to rely so heavily on human tactics is sustainable." Chen's expression remained neutral, but Vexthal noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. "With respect, Counselor, the psychological impact is a reality regardless of tactics employed. War damages people. The only question is whether we're honest about it or pretend it doesn't exist." A Talvori representative, Admiral Kexval, spoke up. His scales were decorated with battle honors from campaigns dating back decades. "The concern, Commodore, is that human forces are being asked to bear a disproportionate burden. Your casualties are significantly higher than any other Alliance military force. Some call this efficiency, others call it exploitation. I call it war," Chen replied bluntly. "Admiral, human forces take higher casualties because we engage in higher risk operations. Boarding actions, close-range combat, assault missions that other species consider too dangerous. We do this because it's effective, not because anyone is forcing us." Another representative, a insectoid Chiran diplomat named Zecht, clicked its mandibles thoughtfully. "Nevertheless, the concern stands. Humanity represents less than 1% of the Alliance's total population, yet human forces have participated in over 40% of combat operations in recent months. This rate is not sustainable for your species." Vexthal watched Chen carefully. He could see the frustration building behind her professional facade. She had fought so hard to prove humanity's worth, and now the Alliance was questioning whether they were being used too much. It was a complex problem with no easy answer. Chen took a breath before responding. "Council members, I understand your concerns, but let me be clear about something. Humans didn't join this war to be protected. We joined because we saw people suffering and decided we could help. Yes, we take casualties. Yes, our tactics are aggressive. But we're achieving results that conventional Alliance forces couldn't match." "At what cost?" Thornak pressed. "Your own reports indicate that combat stress reactions are affecting nearly half your personnel. How much longer can humanity sustain this level of combat operations?" "Longer than you think," Chen said quietly. "Because humans have been doing this for thousands of years. We know how to fight. We know how to endure. We know how to carry the burden of war. But more importantly, we know why we're fighting. The Krell won't stop at Alliance borders. They won't be satisfied with the territory they've already taken. They'll keep expanding, keep conquering, until someone stops them permanently." She activated a holographic display showing Krell expansion patterns over the past decade. "Look at this. Every species they've encountered has been enslaved or exterminated. Billions dead, entire civilizations erased. The Alliance has been fighting defensively for 3 years, trying to minimize losses and preserve forces. I respect that approach, but it was losing. Slowly, steadily losing." The display shifted to show recent battle results. "Human tactics are working because we understand something the Krell understand. Sometimes you have to be willing to pay a higher price than your enemy expects. Sometimes you have to hit harder and faster and more aggressively than they can counter. That's not exploitation. That's survival." Silence filled the chamber. Vexthal felt the weight of her words settling over the assembled representatives. They had called this meeting expecting to discuss limiting human involvement. Instead, Chen had challenged their fundamental understanding of the war. Finally, a human representative who had been sitting quietly spoke up. Ambassador James Park, Earth's senior diplomat to the Alliance, stood with the careful movements of an elderly statesman. "If I may add some perspective from Earth's government, we are aware of the concerns raised here today. We share them. No leader wants to see their people suffer, and war causes immeasurable suffering." He paused, looking around the chamber. "But Earth has a saying, The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. We've seen the Krell's actions. We've reviewed the historical records of their conquests, and we've made a collective decision as a species. We would rather fight and suffer than stand aside and watch others be destroyed. Even at the cost of your own people's well-being, Zurich asked. Especially at that cost, Park replied firmly. Because we know what happens when aggressive powers go unopposed. Earth's history is filled with examples of appeasement failing, of defensive strategies that only prolonged the suffering. Sometimes the merciful choice is to end a conflict decisively, even if it means paying a high price in the short term. Thornak's expression was troubled. You are asking the Alliance to condone a level of violence and sacrifice that goes against our fundamental principles. We pride ourselves on being civilized, on valuing life above all else. And that's admirable, Chen interjected. But the Krell don't share those values. They see civilization as weakness. They see your principles as vulnerability to be exploited. You can't fight an enemy like that with one hand tied behind your back. Admiral Kexival rose from his seat, his scales rustling. I have fought the Krell for 15 cycles. I have watched good warriors die following Alliance protocols and tactics, and I have watched human forces achieve in weeks what we could not accomplish in years. He looked directly at Chen. Commodore, I support your continued operations without restriction. The Alliance needs to accept that winning this war requires accepting methods that make us uncomfortable. Other military representatives began nodding in agreement. The diplomat who had questioned human casualties seemed less certain now. Vexthal realized that the tide of opinion was shifting. The practical reality of winning the war was overriding philosophical concerns. Thornak raised a hand for silence. This council will take the testimony provided here under advisement. However, I propose a compromise. Human forces will continue their combat operations without restriction, but with increased support from Alliance medical and psychological services. We will not limit humanity's contribution, but we will ensure they have the resources needed to manage the consequences. Additionally, Thornak continued, we should begin training Alliance forces in human tactics, not to replace human personnel but to share the burden. If these methods are as effective as demonstrated, then all Alliance military should have access to them. Chen looked surprised at that suggestion. Counselor, human tactics work for humans because of our specific psychology and cultural background. I'm not certain they can be effectively taught to species that don't share our evolutionary history. Then we will adapt them, Kexival said firmly. Take the core principles and modify them for different species. Humans have shown us that aggression and calculated risk-taking can win battles. We need to learn those lessons. The meeting continued for several more hours with various representatives debating specific policies and procedures. But the fundamental decision had been made. Humanity would remain at the forefront of the war effort, and the Alliance would support them fully while learning from their methods. When the council finally adjourned, Vexthal found Chen standing alone in one of the observation lounges, looking out at Vexar Prime's twin moons. He approached quietly. That was well handled, Commodore. You made your point without alienating the council. Chen shook her head. I'm not sure I said what they needed to hear. They're trying to understand humanity through their own cultural lens. They see our tactics as a choice we're making. They don't understand that for us, this is just how war is fought. We don't have a tradition of limited conflict or civilized warfare. When humans fight, we fight to win, whatever the cost. Perhaps that is precisely what they need to understand, Vexthal suggested. You have forced the Alliance to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of this. The final battle for the Krell Core system began on a morning that looked like any other. Vexthal stood on the bridge of the Eternal Vigilance, now flagship of the combined Alliance Human Task Force. 8 months had passed since that first battle, where he had watched humans fight with tactics that defied everything he knew about warfare. 8 months of victories, casualties, and slow grinding progress toward this moment. The Krell had made their last stand here, at their throne world of Carthax. Every remaining ship in their empire, every warrior who could hold a weapon, every resource they could marshal had been gathered for one final, desperate defense. Intelligence estimates put their numbers at over 200 capital ships and supporting vessels. It was the largest concentration of Krell military power ever assembled in one place. Against them stood a fleet of Alliance vessels and human warships that had been transformed by months of combined operations. The Talvori ships still maintained their elegant designs, but now they carried human weapons as backup armament. Jiran vessels had adopted human shield modifications. Even the cautious Vexari had learned to be more aggressive in their tactics. The humans had changed the Alliance military in fundamental ways, not just through their presence, but through the lessons their methods taught. Commodore Chen's face appeared on the main view screen. She looked older than when they had first met. The past months had etched lines around her eyes and mouth, marks of command and responsibility, but her voice was steady when she spoke.
All fleet commanders, this is Chen. Final position reports?
Confirmations came in from dozens of vessels. The fleet was ready, every ship in position, every crew prepared for what was coming. Vextal noted that the responses from Alliance commanders no longer carried the hesitation or uncertainty he had heard in earlier battles. They had learned to trust in human tactics even when those tactics seemed mad. Commander Vextal, Chen said, addressing him directly, your task force will lead the initial assault on the orbital defense platforms. Once you've cleared a path, human boarding teams will move in to disable the planetary shield generators. Standard Pattern Alpha. Understood, Commodore. Standard Pattern Alpha. How strange that such aggressive, risky tactics had become standard. My ships are ready to execute. Chen's expression softened slightly. Commander, I want you to know something. Whatever happens today, it's been an honor serving alongside the Talvori. You and your people have adapted to human methods better than we had any right to expect. Thank you for that. The honor has been ours, Commodore, Vextal replied formally, but inside he felt a complicated tangle of emotions. Pride in what they had accomplished, fear of what was coming, and something else he couldn't quite name, a sense that today would change everything, one way or another. The battle began with a thunderous exchange of fire as the Alliance fleet engaged the outer defense platforms. These were massive structures, bristling with weapons and shielded by overlapping energy fields that had taken the Krell decades to construct. Vextal's task force moved in precise formation, focusing fire on weak points that human intelligence had identified through months of analysis. The platforms fought back with devastating effect. Vextal watched as a Vexari cruiser took a direct hit from a heavy plasma cannon and broke apart, atmosphere venting into space along with the bodies of the crew. Nara called out damage reports in a steady voice, though her scales had paled to almost white. They were taking heavy casualties, losing ships at a rate that would have caused Alliance commanders to retreat in any earlier engagement. But they didn't retreat. They pressed forward, following the human example they had learned so painfully over the past months. When one ship fell, another moved to take its place. When shields failed, crews fought on with damaged systems and desperate courage. The orbital platforms began to crack under the sustained assault, their shields collapsing one by one. Then the human ships moved in. Vextal had seen human boarding operations dozens of times now, but they still took his breath away. Assault pods launched from human carriers in swarms, using the chaos of battle as cover. They struck the platforms with precise timing. Teams of armored humans cutting their way inside to sabotage critical systems from within. The largest platform, anchoring the entire defensive network, fell silent as human teams reached its reactor core. Vextal's sensors showed the power signature fluctuating wildly before the entire structure went dark. Within minutes, the planetary shields began to fail, flickering and dying as the generators lost their orbital support. Shields down, Nara reported, her voice carrying a note of triumph. Planetary surface is exposed. Chen's voice cut through the communication channels. All human assault vessels commence landing operations. Alliance fleet, maintain orbital superiority and suppress ground-based defenses. This is it, people. Let's finish this. Vextal watched as human transports and dropships descended through the atmosphere toward the Krell homeworld. His sensors tracked dozens of landing sites across the primary continent. The humans weren't trying to be subtle or strategic. They were landing everywhere at once, overwhelming the Krell's ability to respond. It was a massive, coordinated assault that only human forces had the aggression and fearlessness to attempt. The ground battle that followed lasted 3 days. Vextal remained in orbit, coordinating fleet operations and watching sensor feeds from the surface. What he saw reinforced everything he had learned about humanity over the past months. They fought with the same relentless determination they had shown in every battle. They took casualties that would have broken other species. They pushed forward even when the situation seemed hopeless. But they also showed something else. Something Vexthal hadn't fully appreciated before. In between the firefights and assaults, human soldiers helped Krell civilians who had been caught in the crossfire. They provided medical treatment to wounded enemies. They showed mercy when it was tactically unnecessary and strategically risky. Even in the midst of this brutal final battle, humans remembered that their enemies were living beings. On the third day, the Krell government surrendered. The message came through Alliance diplomatic channels, formal and defeated. The Krell Empress, speaking from her throne room surrounded by human soldiers, offered unconditional surrender and requested terms for her people's survival. The war was over. When the news spread through the fleet, reactions were mixed. Relief, certainly. Joy at survival. Grief for those who hadn't made it to see this day. But also a strange sense of emptiness. After months of constant combat, sudden peace felt almost unnatural. Vexthal found himself on the surface 2 days later, standing in what had been the Krell Military Command Center. Human engineers were already working to restore damaged infrastructure. Alliance diplomats were coordinating with surrendered Krell officials to establish provisional governance. The process of transforming from war to peace had begun. He found Commodore Chen in what had been the Empress's strategy room, reviewing holographic maps and deployment schedules. She looked exhausted, her uniform rumpled and stained.